Interestingly, we also see art related to slavery in ancient Rome, and it's actually going to play a pretty big role in society. Now, slavery in ancient Rome is very, very common. We have people who are working manual labor. So, for example, they might be working in a mine, an industrial sort of setting, or rowing a ship. And you would not want to be that kind of slave. Those are typically the ones that have no other skills, who have, good musculature, etc., but they don't have skills as a sculptor, a tutor, or mathematician, etc. And these are going to be, the slaves that you wouldn't want to be that kind of slavery, involved in that kind of slavery. They're going to die in service. We also have domestic slaves. Now, if your parents own a car today, you probably owned a slave as a family. It was very, very common. These are generally prisoners of war brought back, and this is a way of incorporating more genetic material, more skills, etc., into a society. Also, bringing in labor when your society doesn't want to perform that labor. And you also brought in, of course, as we've talked about in other societies, highly skilled professions, accountants, physicians, artists, tutors, etc. Greek slaves were often prized for their education, and slavery really ran the Roman Empire. When we get to the empire, you see a problem of unemployment, 30 to 50% unemployment, because if the economy runs on slavery, well, they don't need to hire someone and pay them. They can have these slaves do these jobs for them. But unlike the American South, they are prizing highly skilled slaves, and they would have a lot more freedom than they would in the American South. So all but the poorest own slaves, and slaves, outside of the ones working in mines, etc., are often going to be freed. So it's not uncommon for someone to free their domestic slaves when they die. Or sometimes the slaves are allowed to have, in many cases, jobs outside of the home or elsewhere, and they can save up money and literally buy their own freedom. And the freedom would be gained if granted, frequently if the master dies, but also if purchased. There are slaves that die as slaves, as we talked about. Now, the law states that slaves cannot be depicted in art. And obviously, we see slaves in art, but you'll notice that they're not individualized. We wouldn't be able to recognize them. There are no portraits. And this is why, when you are freed, generally the first thing you do is commission a sculpture of some form. It could be a sarcophagus, which is what we're going to be looking at in the upper left there, but it could be a bust. And this is always done to show that you are now free, because you weren't allowed to be depicted in art before that. Kind of gets at that idea of representation being incredibly important. People want nothing more than to be represented, to see themselves in the culture. In this case, we're looking at a relief on a tomb. Tombs often lined the roads outside of town. And you see two men with a person in the middle. The older man in the middle is their former owner. And then the two men at the sides are the Jesse brothers, who had been slaves and have now been freed. Now, why depict yourself with your former slave owner? Well, in Roman society, if you were freed, you were still the owner's responsibility. He doesn't own you anymore. But there's a client-patron relationship there. So if they fell on hard times, he would be expected to help them out. It's a very interesting system, very different from what we're familiar with, again, in the American South. And we see this portrait tradition because they want to see that representation. The inscription around it in Latin tells us who they are and who he is and about their relationship. That he's a good master, or was a good master, that he provided for them, that he took care of them, and that they were successful in life afterwards. It's a very interesting way of looking at the world, and it makes sense. If slaves almost outnumber the Romans themselves, in some cases they do, depending where you are, the idea of respecting them, especially after they're slaves, is going to be important, because who's going to revolt when you know that freedom is a possibility, when that carrot can be dangled in front of you at any time?